Have you ever noticed yourself, repeating certain patterns in your relationships or maybe hitting the same communication roadblocks time and again? It's striking how those early bonds, those first relationships can really continue to shape our lives deeply.
Yeah, it really is. And today, we're planning to take a deep dive into attachment theory.
Right, which gives us this powerful lens for understanding why these patterns pop up and, well, stick around.
Exactly. Attachment theory, you've got key figures like John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth.
Mm.
It basically suggests that how we connect with our main caregivers, way back in our earliest years,
Yeah.
that really lays the groundwork for how we relate to other people throughout our whole lives.
The foundation. So our mission today is to really unpack the core ideas behind adult attachment styles. We've got some really fascinating sources to draw on.
We do. There are articles looking at the wide-ranging impact of these styles.
And a really detailed study, too, looking at how attachment actually affects the way we deliver difficult news, which sounds fascinating.
Oh, it is. And we also have some perspectives on how culture fits into the picture, which is often overlooked.
Definitely. So get ready, because we're exploring how these early experiences influence, well, pretty much everything: communication, relationships, even how we handle those awkward, uncomfortable truths.
Okay, let's dig in then. So attachment styles. Think of them as these lasting ways we tend to relate to others.
Enduring patterns, yeah.
And the roots are really firmly planted back in childhood. What's particularly interesting, I think, is this idea of intergenerational continuity.
Oh, right. That's a big one, isn't it? This idea that our parents' attachment style could influence how they parented us, which then shapes our style, and it just
Yeah.
keeps going, like passing down relational blueprints.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
So if my parents had a certain style, am I just destined to repeat it? Is that how it works?
Well, that's a great question. And actually understanding this continuity, that's kind of the first step in recognizing and potentially changing those patterns,
Right.
especially if they're not really working for you. It really highlights that potential for healing,
Yeah.
for breaking those cycles.
That's hopeful.
It is. Now, based on Mary Ainsworth's original work and then later research, we usually talk about 4 main adult attachment styles.
Okay, let's break those down. First one is secure attachment. What does that actually look like in, adult relationships?
Right. So securely attached people, they generally feel comfortable expressing themselves, thoughts, feelings, pretty open.
Okay.
They're usually supportive partners, good at navigating rough patches together. They tend to value honesty, equality in their relationships.
Sounds healthy.
Yeah, generally they have a positive view of themselves and others. They're okay with intimacy, but also fine with independence.
A good balance.
Exactly. And they tend to be pretty good at forgiving, but also at setting, healthy boundaries.
Okay, that makes sense. So that's secure. Then we have anxious attachment. What are the sort of key features there?
Anxious attachment. Individuals with this style often wrestle with a lower sense of self-worth. They might rely quite heavily on relationships for validation. Sometimes they feel like their partner is somehow better than them, and they might find themselves drawn to partners who are maybe less reliable or emotionally inconsistent.
Why is that?
It might be because it feels familiar, somehow echoing earlier experiences. But a really central thing is this deep fear of rejection, of abandonment.
Oh, okay.
And alongside that, a very strong desire for closeness, which almost paradoxically
Yeah.
can lead to behaviors like needing constant reassurance or needing to be physically very close all the time that can sometimes inadvertently push partners away.
Wow. So wanting connection so intensely, it kind of triggers the very fear they're trying to avoid.
Precisely. It's a tough spot.
Yeah, I can see that. Okay, now what about avoidant attachment? I know you mentioned there are sort of different flavors of this, including disorganized or fearful avoidant.
You're right. Avoidant attachment, just broadly speaking, is marked by a discomfort with deep closeness, with interdependence.
Okay.
These individuals often really value their independence, sometimes to an extreme, and can be quite hesitant to truly open up emotionally.
Keep people at arm's length, maybe.
Sort of, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Now, disorganized attachment, also called fearful avoidant, it's more complex.
And also.
Think about it like this. Someone with a disorganized style likely had caregivers who were, confusingly, both a source of comfort and a source of fear.
Oh, wow. Okay. That sounds difficult.
It creates this really intense internal conflict. They want connection, like everyone does, but their past experiences taught them that getting close can be unreliable, maybe even unsafe.
So they're afraid of the very thing they might want.
Exactly. Hence, fearful avoidant. They desire intimacy, but they're also deeply afraid of what getting close might actually entail.
So how does that play out?
It can lead to struggles with trust, maybe difficulty showing empathy sometimes, worrying a lot about their partner's
A lot of anxiety there.
Definitely. And sometimes a real back and forth with intimacy, like a push-pull dynamic. They might also try to downplay how important relationships are to them overall. It's like high avoidance and high anxiety, often together.
That sounds like a real internal battle. Wanting connection, but also being terrified of it because of the past.
It is. And it's really important, like our sources point out, to remember that even if one style feels very familiar, our attachment style isn't necessarily set in stone for life. It can actually shift.
Oh, really? How?
Depending on the specific relationships we're in
Yeah.
and also the personal work we do, understanding ourselves better.
That's good to know. So it's not a life sentence.
Not at all. And this leads directly into how we communicate, because our attachment style has a really significant impact there.
Right, on the quality of both verbal and nonverbal communication.
Exactly. The way we see ourselves, the way we see others, it fundamentally shapes how and what we communicate in our relationships.
Okay, so how do these different styles tend to show up, say, in disagreements or moments of intimacy?
Well, secure folks, they tend towards open, honest communication. They can usually tackle conflicts pretty directly and try to find, constructive solutions.
Makes sense.
Anxiously attached individuals, though, they might constantly seek closeness and reassurance through their communication, which can sometimes feel a bit overwhelming, maybe even like crossing boundaries for their partner.
Too much, maybe.
Potentially, yeah. And then avoidantly attached people.
Yeah.
They might really struggle to open up, to share deep feelings. And that can, understandably, create a kind of lack of emotional depth or intimacy in the relationship.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. One of our sources, this research study, it looks specifically at how attachment influences the way we communicate unpleasant truths.
Ah, yes, that study. Really fascinating design.
Tell us about it. What were they trying to find out?
Well, it had a couple of main goals. First, just to observe how people actually go about delivering news that could, make someone feel bad, face-threatening news, as they called it.
Right.
And second, to see if the way they did it was connected to their underlying attachment style.
And how did they set it up?
They used this clever cover story about participating in a game. One person in each pair, the spokesperson, had the job of telling their partner they got a really low score. That was the displeasing truth.
Awkward.
Definitely. And they video recorded these interactions, then meticulously analyzed the verbal content, what was actually said.
Okay, and what were the main communication styles they saw in that first part?
They basically found two main approaches. Straight communication, pretty direct, to the point.
Just rip the Band-Aid off?
Kinda, yeah. And then mitigated communication.
Okay.
That involved softening the blow, cushioning the bad news somehow.
And did those styles connect to attachment?
They found a link, yes.
Huh.
Using that mitigated style, doing things like reassuring the partner, saying the game was super hard, downplaying their own abilities, even saying, the researcher told me to tell you this.
Deflecting a bit.
Right. That was connected to what the researchers called a high need for approval and confirmation by others.
Which sounds like...
Which really reflects characteristics of anxious attachment. The more negative view of oneself, worrying about rejection.
So they're trying to manage the other person's reaction, maybe to manage their own anxiety about that reaction.
Exactly. It seems the aim was to reduce their own relational anxiety by trying to prevent a negative response. Prioritizing the other person's feelings, perhaps, to avoid feeling rejected themselves.
That makes a lot of sense. So what about the second part of the study? How did that build on this?
The second study used a similar setup but went deeper. They added questionnaires for both people involved, the spokesperson and the receiver, asking about their emotions, how they saw the interaction.
Getting both sides of it.
Right. And this allowed for a more nuanced look at communication strategies. They identified things like reticence, like being really hesitant to even say it.
Delaying tactics, maybe?
Yes, could be. And then various types of mitigation, and also different kinds of frankness, including one they actually labeled brutal.
Brutal frankness. Wow. Okay, so how did attachment link to these more specific approaches?
This was really interesting. They found that spokespersons who scored high on avoidant attachment had a greater tendency towards using that franker style. Sometimes even the brutal one.
Why would that be?
Well, It aligns pretty well with that negative model of others often seen in avoidant attachment. The lack of deep trust, the desire to keep distance.
So they're maybe less worried about the emotional fallout.
It seems that way, almost as if they're less concerned about the potential negative impact of the truth on their partner, or maybe even on the relationship itself.
Yeah.
If you're less comfortable with closeness anyway.
You might be less inclined to sugarcoat things. Makes sense. What about how those avoidant spokespersons saw their partners in that moment?
Sometimes they actually perceive their partners as being more collaborative than they perhaps really were, which might suggest maybe a difficulty in really tuning into or understanding their partner's potential discomfort. Like maybe they couldn't easily imagine the other person feeling bad.
Interesting.
However, there was a little twist. Those avoidant individuals who used reticence, the hesitant ones,
Yeah.
they actually reported that they would have felt more worried if they'd been on the receiving end of the bad news.
Huh. So maybe some awareness there.
The researchers called it a potential benevolent facet of their negative view of others, like maybe an underlying concern, even if it doesn't come across strongly in their actions.
Fascinating. So the big picture seems to be anxious folks might mitigate, avoidant folks might be more blunt when delivering bad news.
That's the general trend they found, yeah. And, of course, how the receiver actually reacts to the news is also going to be influenced by their own attachment style, too. It's
Yeah.
a two-way street.
Absolutely. Okay, let's shift gears a bit now and talk about culture, because our sources brought up some really important points about how culture interacts with all this attachment stuff.
Oh, definitely. It's absolutely crucial to recognize that culture plays a huge role. It shapes how attachment behaviors are expressed, what they even mean in a specific context,
Right.
and just the sheer diversity we see in relationship patterns across the globe.
Mm-hmm.
One really interesting concept is allo-parenting.
Allo-parenting. Okay, what does that mean exactly?
It basically refers to childcare systems, where the responsibility isn't just on the biological parents. It's shared among multiple people in the community.
So like aunts, uncles, grandparents, neighbors.
Exactly. Groups like the Akau foragers in Central Africa or the Bang people in West Africa are great examples. Infants there are often cared for by lots of different people, extended family, other community members.
So they're forming bonds with multiple caregivers from the start.
Right. Which naturally leads to different patterns of attachment and a much more communal way of raising kids. It's quite different from the typical Western focus on that primary mother-infant bond.
That is a big difference. So does this mean attachment theory, which, let's face it, mostly came out of Western research, does it actually apply universally, everywhere?
Well, that's a really important question, and some researchers definitely challenge its universal applicability.
How so?
For instance, certain behaviors you might see in kids, like what might get labeled ambivalent behavior in Japanese children, could have totally different cultural meanings compared to how we'd interpret it here.
Okay, context matters.
Hugely.
Yeah.
Plus, things like socioeconomic status, cultural norms, they influence attachment security too.
Mhm.
There's a study comparing African American and white American kids.
Yeah.
It suggested things like, say, lower income might impact a parent sensitivity just due to stress and resource limitations, which can then affect secure attachment forming.
Makes sense.
And also, African American socialization practices might encourage certain behaviors, maybe more independence or assertiveness, that standard attachment tests sometimes score as less secure, even if those behaviors are perfectly healthy and adaptive within that cultural context.
So the tools we use to measure attachment might even have cultural biases built in.
That's definitely a concern raised by some researchers. So the takeaway is, while that fundamental human need for connection seems universal,
Mm-hmm.
the way those connections look, how they're expressed, how they're even measured, that can vary a lot across cultures, and even within the same culture.
Right, so variation within cultures can be as big or bigger than between them.
Precisely. While secure attachment does seem pretty common globally, the proportions of different styles can vary. And yeah, often the differences within a culture are larger than the average differences between cultures.
Okay. Let's bring this back to adult romantic relationships then, specifically thinking about intimacy and sexuality. How did these attachment styles play out there?
Yeah, this is a really crucial area
Mm-hmm.
because those underlying attachment insecurities we carry, they can definitely impact the physical side of relationships for both partners.
How does that show up in the research?
Well, research links avoidant attachment, for instance, with a tendency to actually try and avoid sexual relations sometimes.
Really?
Yeah, and generally a lower frequency of sex within the relationship.
Which fits with that discomfort with closeness we talked about earlier.
Exactly. It aligns.
What about people with anxious attachment?
They might be more likely to report feeling pressured or anxious around sexual activity, like there's a performance anxiety or a fear tied into it. And what's also interesting are the interaction effects. What happens when you put different styles together?
Ah, the dynamic between partners. Yeah.
So, for example, couples where both partners are highly avoidant, they tend to report very low frequency of sex.
Double the avoidance.
Kind of, yeah. And in pairings where you have one anxiously attached person and one avoidantly attached person, that classic push-pull dynamic,
Yeah.
you often see increased reports of feeling pressured into sex, more avoidance around sex, and just general difficulties and dissatisfaction with their sex life.
Wow. So these combinations can create some really tricky, sometimes painful dynamics in the bedroom.
They certainly can.
Hmm.
However, and this is a really, really important point to stress,
Okay.
attachment styles aren't fixed. They're not destiny. There is absolutely potential for change. We can actively work towards developing a more secure attachment style over time.
Okay, that's really encouraging. That's good news. Our sources talked about this ways people can move towards more security, towards healing. What were some of the key things there?
Yeah, several important themes came up. Building a stronger sense of self-worth seems absolutely fundamental,
Right.
as is learning to recognize and understand those negative patterns that might be playing out, like maybe a tendency to always blame yourself or always blame others.
Becoming aware of your own script.
Exactly. And just educating yourself about attachment theory itself, understanding what it is, can be incredibly empowering. Gives you insight into your own behavior and the dynamics you see.
Knowledge is power.
It really is. Also, having secure, supportive role models in your life, people who offer consistent, reliable support, that can make a huge positive difference.
So it's kind of a mix of internal work on self-worth, on patterns, and also the influence of healthy relationships around you.
Precisely. It's often both.
What other sort of practical things can someone do?
Well, learning to become more comfortable with closeness, which can be hard. Addressing and working through those underlying fears. Fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of intimacy itself.
Tackling the core fear.
Yeah, establishing healthy boundaries is huge. Learning to say no, learning what's okay for you, and prioritizing self-care, looking after your own needs.
Yeah, boundaries are so important.
Absolutely. And like we touched on earlier, actually being in a relationship with a securely attached partner can be really healing in itself.
How so?
Just experiencing that consistent, reliable connection, that safety, can help sort of retrain your expectations and foster a more secure style over time.
Like learning and experiencing.
Ex-
It sounds like it's definitely a process, though, a journey of self-discovery and growth,
Oh, for sure.
and probably important to be kind to yourself along the way. Patient.
Absolutely critical.
Yeah.
Healing takes time. It takes self-compassion. It takes a willingness to really pay attention.
Yeah.
Mindfulness, you could call it, to your own feelings and how they impact your interactions. And as one of our sources put it really well, just gaining an understanding of your own attachment style. That's truly the very first step on that whole journey.
Right, knowing where you're starting from.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we bring this all together, attachment theory really does give us this incredibly useful, insightful way to understand those deep patterns in our relationships and how we communicate.
It's powerful stuff.
And realizing it all stems back to those early childhood experiences, which just keep echoing through our adult lives in really significant ways.
Yeah, the echoes are strong.
Yeah.
But, and this is the hopeful part, while those patterns can feel so ingrained, so automatic, it's just so important to remember they are not permanent. They're not immutable.
We're not stuck.
We're not stuck. With more awareness, with understanding, with conscious effort, we absolutely have the ability to shift, to move towards greater security, and to build healthier, genuinely more fulfilling connections.
But that's a really empowering message to end on. It really is. And it leaves me wondering, as you're listening, which attachment style might ring most true for you? Which one resonates with your experiences?
A good question to ponder.
And how might understanding these dynamics maybe open up pathways to more fulfilling connections in your own life? Perhaps that's something worth exploring a bit more on your own time.
Definitely food for thought.
It really is. Well, thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive today.
My pleasure.